You're standing in the shadowed corridors of Versailles in 1751, your footsteps muffled by thick carpets as you follow a nervous servant down a passage that doesn't appear on any official palace map. The air grows colder with each step, and you notice something unsettling. The portraits lining these walls show faces that somehow don't quite align with the classical beauty expected of royal blood. The servant stops before a heavy oak door, reinforced with iron, fumbles with an ornate key, and whispers a warning that chills your blood. What you're about to see must never leave these walls. The king's reputation, the very stability of France, depends on your silence. As the door creaks open, you peer into a world that official court historians would spend centuries trying to erase. A hidden wing where the most powerful families in Europe concealed their darkest genetic secrets. Here, in chambers designed more like prisons than nurseries, lived the children that royal bloodlines produced but could never acknowledge. Children whose very existence threatened the divine image of monarchy itself. Before diving into these forgotten stories of hidden suffering and family shame, if you enjoy learning about the dark truths lurking behind history's golden facades, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible exploring that these buried secrets together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the stories power never wanted us to know. The practice of hiding deformed or mentally disabled royal children wasn't the exception centuries European, it was the rule. For monarchies operated under the terrifying logic that their right to rule came directly from God, which meant their bloodlines were supposed to be pure, blessed, and above the flaws that plagued common people. But what happened when nature refused to cooperate with political propaganda? What did royal families do when their carefully controlled breeding programs produced children who couldn't be displayed as symbols of divine favor? They disappeared them. Not through murder, that would be too risky politically and spiritually, but through a more insidious form of erasure. These children were hidden away in secret wings of palaces, remote monasteries, or isolated country estates, where they could live and die without ever threatening the carefully constructed myth of royal perfection. Our first glimpse into this shadowy world comes from the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. In 1661, Marie-Thérèse of Austria's Louis Queen gave birth to what court physicians carefully described in their private notes as a child bearing unusual characteristics. The official birth announcement spoke only of the healthy birth of a princess, but behind closed doors, a different story unfolded. The infant, who would never receive official name in court records, was born with what we would now recognize as severe developmental abnormalities. Her skull was misshapen, her limbs were disproportionate, and her mental development would never progress beyond that of a young child. For any common family, this would be a private tragedy to be endured with whatever resources they possessed. But for the most powerful monarchy in Europe, it represented a catastrophic threat to their entire political foundation. Within hours of the birth, the child vanished from official existence. Court records were altered, witnesses were sworn to secrecy under penalty of death, and the Queen was told her daughter had died from complications shortly after birth. Marie-Thérèse would spend the rest of her life grieving a child who was actually living less than a mile away, hidden in apartments beneath the palace that had been converted into a secret nursery. The arrangements for concealing royal children with disabilities became increasingly sophisticated practiced as spread across European courts. Specialized servants were recruited, often from religious orders where vows of silence could be trusted absolutely. These caregivers, known euphemistically as special attendants, were paid enormous sums for their discretion and faced execution if they ever revealed what they had witnessed. The hidden princess at Versailles lived in chambers that were comfortable but completely isolated from the outside world. She had nurses who attended to her physical needs, teachers who attempted basic education despite her limitations, and even companions usually children of servants who had been born with similar conditions and whose families had been quietly relocated to the palace to serve this secret household. But the psychological cost of this concealment extended far beyond the hidden children themselves. The parents who made these decisions carried crushing guilt that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. Louis XIV, despite his reputation for absolute confidence, began showing signs of what court physicians privately described as melancholic episodes, periods of intense depression and anxiety that coincided with visits to his hidden daughter. Marie-Thérèse's mental health deteriorated even more dramatically. Believing her daughter was dead, she developed an obsession with charity work involving disabled children in Paris. She would visit orphanages and hospitals, seeking out the most severely impaired children and lavishing attention on them in ways that puzzled and sometimes scandalized the court. What no one understood was that she was trying to mother children who reminded her of the daughter she thought she had lost. The hidden princess lived for 17 years in her secret apartments, growing from a severely disabled infant into a young woman whose condition had, if anything, worsened with age. She required constant care, could not speak coherently, and showed no recognition of the elaborate world that had been constructed around her concealment. When she finally died in 1678, her death went unrecorded in any official document. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the palace grounds, and even her caregivers were forbidden from acknowledging that she had ever existed. The French system of concealment became a model that other European courts studied and adapted to their own needs. The Spanish Habsburgs, already struggling with the genetic consequences of centuries of inbreeding, developed perhaps the most elaborate network of hidden facilities for their disabled children. The English court, under the later Stuarts, created what they called country retreats, isolated estates where inconvenient royal children could be housed under the pretense of enjoying rural air for their health. But it was in the German states where the practice reached its most systematic and horrifying expression. The Holy Roman Empire's complex political structure, with dozens of small courts, all competing for legitimacy, created intense pressure to maintain the appearance of genetic superiority. German princes couldn't afford to show any weakness that might be exploited by rivals, which meant that disabled children represented not just personal tragedies, but existential threats to their family's political survival. Prince Elector Augustus of Saxony perfected a system that would be copied throughout the German states for the next century. When his wife gave birth to a son with what court physicians described as severe mental deficiencies and physical malformations in 1693, Augustus didn't just hide the child, he created an entire false identity for him. The real prince, christened Frederick Augustus, was secretly placed in a remote monastery where he would live under the name Brother Benedict. Meanwhile, a healthy peasant child of approximately the same age was brought to court, given the prince's name and identity, and raised as the heir apparent. The deception was so complete that even the substitute child eventually believed he was the legitimate prince, while the real Frederick Augustus lived and died in monastic obscurity, never knowing his true identity. This practice of substitution became more common as royal families realized that simply hiding disabled children wasn't enough. They needed healthy alternatives to maintain their dynastic claims. Across Europe, a secret trade developed in healthy infants who could serve as replacements for inconvenient royal children. Peasant families were paid enormous sums to surrender their babies, often being told that their children were being adopted by wealthy nobles who couldn't have children of their own. The psychological toll on the families involved was devastating, but the broader social implications were even more disturbing. The substitution system created a shadow aristocracy, where the people ruling European territories weren't actually the bloodline heirs they claimed to be. DNA testing didn't exist, birth certificates could be forged, and the only witnesses to these switches were either dead, paid off, or bound by religious vows. This meant that some of the most important political decisions in European history were being made by peasant children who had been raised to believe they were divinely appointed royalty. The most disturbing aspect of this deception wasn't the fraud itself, but how it perpetuated the very system that created the problem. These substitute rulers, believing themselves to be of pure royal blood, continued arranging the same types of cousin marriages and inbred alliances that had produced the disabled children they had replaced. They unknowingly maintained breeding practices that virtually guaranteed future generations would face the same genetic catastrophes. Meanwhile, the real royal children who had been hidden away lived lives of unimaginable isolation and confusion. Many were told they were orphans or bastards being cared for out of Christian charity. Others were given false identities as the children of deceased servants. A few were told nothing at all, left to develop whatever understanding they could with minds that often couldn't grasp the complexity of their situations. The caregivers who tended these hidden children developed their own culture of secrecy and shared trauma. They passed down techniques for managing different types of disabilities, created informal networks of communication between various hidden facilities, and developed an almost religious dedication to protecting their charges from the outside world. Some began to see themselves as guardians of the true royal bloodline, preserving the authentic heirs while impostors ruled in their place. Letters discovered in monastery archives reveal the psychological complexity of these caregivers' positions. Sister Marguerite, who spent 30 years caring for a hidden Habsburg prince in a Bavarian convent, wrote to her superior, "The child I tend is more truly noble in his innocence than the man who wears his crown. Yet I am sworn to ensure that this truth dies with me, and I fear I am complicit in a deception that mocks God's will." The hidden children themselves, despite their various disabilities, often developed remarkable emotional intelligence about their situations. Court physicians' private notes described children who couldn't speak coherently, but who seemed to understand that they were being kept secret. They would hide when strangers approached, refuse to look at mirrors, and show signs of profound sadness that couldn't be explained by their medical conditions alone. One particularly heartbreaking case involved Princess Maria Josefa of Portugal, born in 1734 with severe physical deformities and cognitive disabilities. She was hidden in a convent outside Lisbon, where she lived for 43 years under the name Sister Esperança. Despite her limitations, she showed remarkable artistic ability, creating hundreds of small sculptures and drawings that depicted figures behind bars, children reaching through windows, and families separated by walls. The nuns who cared for her reported that she would often sit by her window during court ceremonies, watching the carriages pass by on the road below. When asked what she was looking for, she would point to herself and then to the carriages, suggesting some deep understanding that she belonged to that world but had been excluded from it. Her artwork became increasingly sophisticated over the years, and some pieces showed such technical skill that modern art historians believe she may have been far more intellectually capable than her caregivers realized. The economic cost of maintaining these hidden populations was staggering. European royal treasuries spent enormous sums on secret facilities of Versailles alone, maintained 1750, each requiring staff, specialized caregivers, and the elaborate deceptions needed to maintain the substitutions, the court supplies, and constant security. But the financial different secret facilities for hidden royal children by burden was nothing compared to the psychological cost that rippled through entire royal families. Parents who had hidden their disabled children often became obsessed with producing more heirs, leading to larger families and increased chances of genetic problems. They would study their subsequent children obsessively, looking for any signs of the conditions they feared, and often became convinced that normal childhood behaviors were symptoms of hidden disabilities. Queen Maria Anna of Spain, who had hidden 3 children with various genetic conditions, became so paranoid about her remaining children that she insisted on examining them personally every morning. She would measure their skulls, test their reflexes, and document any changes in their behavior. Her healthy children grew up believing that something was fundamentally wrong with them, creating psychological trauma that affected their own ability to form normal relationships and govern effectively. The practice of concealment also created opportunities for political manipulation that changed the course of European history. Rival courts would sometimes discover evidence of hidden children and use this information as blackmail. The threat of revealing a royal family's genetic secrets became a powerful diplomatic weapon, more effective than military pressure in forcing political concessions. In 1763, the Prussian court obtained detailed documentation about hidden children in the Saxon royal family and used this intelligence to force territorial concessions that significantly altered the balance of power in Central Europe. The Saxon elector, faced with the choice between losing land or having his dynasty's legitimacy destroyed, chose to surrender territory rather than risk exposure. The French Revolution marked the beginning of the end for systematic concealment of disabled royal children, but not for humanitarian reasons. As royal families fled or were executed, the secret facilities they had maintained were abandoned. Revolutionary authorities discovered dozens of hidden children in various palaces and convents, and their existence became powerful propaganda against the monarchy. Revolutionary pamphlets described the discovery of these hidden children as evidence of royal corruption and deception. While they claimed divine appointment, one pamphlet declared, they hid the proof of their own cursed blood in dungeons beneath their golden palaces. The children themselves became symbols of aristocratic hypocrisy, though few lived long enough to benefit from their newfound recognition. The trauma of sudden exposure to the outside world proved overwhelming for most of the hidden children. Having lived their entire lives in isolation, they couldn't adapt to normal social interactions or public attention. Many died within months of being discovered, their compromised immune systems unable to handle new environments and diseases. As we delve deeper into these forgotten chambers of European palaces, we begin to understand that the children hidden away weren't just victims of genetic lottery. They were casualties of a political system that valued appearance over reality, propaganda over truth. The very foundations of monarchy rested on the lie that royal blood was different, purer, blessed by God. When nature produced evidence to the contrary, the response wasn't to question the system, but to hide the evidence. The hidden children who survived into adulthood faced perhaps the cruelest fate of all, living long enough to understand exactly what had been stolen from them. In the archives of the Benedictine monastery of St. Gallen, researchers have uncovered the diary of a man known only as Brother Thomas, who spent 47 years believing he was an orphaned bastard before discovering the truth about his identity in the most devastating way possible. Brother Thomas had lived his entire adult life as a monk, devoted to prayer and scholarly work, accepting his humble origins as God's plan for his existence. He was intelligent, articulate, and showed remarkable skill in languages and mathematics, abilities that his fellow monks attributed to divine blessing rather than noble breeding. In 1789, as revolutionary fervor spread across Europe, a dying confessor revealed the truth that shattered his world entirely. Brother Thomas was actually Prince Leopold of Baden, the rightful heir to one of the most powerful German states. He had been born with a cleft palate and mild cognitive delays that court physicians had deemed incompatible with royal dignity. At 6 months old, he had been secretly placed in the monastery, while a healthy peasant child took his place at court. The man Brother Thomas had spent his life praying for, the usurper duke who ruled Baden, was actually the peasant boy who had stolen his identity, his inheritance, and his entire life. The diary entries that follow this revelation are among the most heartbreaking documents in European history. "I have knelt in prayer for 47 years, Brother Thomas wrote, thanking God for the charity that saved an abandoned bastard from starvation. Now I discover that every prayer was a mockery, every moment of gratitude was built on lies. The peasant boy who wears my crown never knew hunger, never knew shame, never spent a single night wondering why his father abandoned him to strangers. But Brother Thomas's story reveals an even darker truth about the substitution system. When he confronted the monastery's abbot with this revelation, expecting support or at least acknowledgement of the injustice done to him, he discovered that the religious authorities had been complicit in far more than just concealment. The monastery had received enormous annual payments from the Baden court for his care, payments that had funded the construction of new buildings, the acquisition of rare manuscripts, and the comfortable lifestyle of the monks who had raised him. The abbot's response, carefully recorded in monastery records, shows the moral bankruptcy of the entire system. You have lived a life of spiritual purpose, daily power. Would you truly trade your souls free from the corruptions of world salvation for a crown that brings only sin and suffering? God's plan is not for man to question. Brother Thomas spent his remaining years in bitter isolation, forbidden from leaving the monastery or attempting to reclaim his identity, dying in 1802 as both a prince and a prisoner. The substitution system created not just individual tragedies, but dynastic chaos that affected European politics for generations. DNA analysis of royal remains, conducted in recent decades, has revealed that several major European ruling houses were founded on completely fraudulent bloodlines. The implications are staggering. Wars were fought, treaties signed, and millions of lives lost to preserve the power of people who had no legitimate claim to their thrones. Perhaps the most shocking revelation came in 1987, when genetic testing of the Bavarian royal crypt revealed that Duke Maximilian IV, who ruled from 1799 to 1825 and played a crucial role in the Napoleonic Wars, was genetically unrelated to any member of the supposed Wittelsbach dynasty. Further investigation revealed evidence that the real Maximilian had been born with severe hydrocephalus and had been secretly replaced in infancy. The peasant who became duke had unknowingly married his supposed cousin, Isabella of Baden, who was actually from an entirely different bloodline altogether. The psychological damage inflicted by these deceptions rippled through families in ways that court physicians never anticipated. Children who grew up as substitutes, even when they never learned the truth, often developed severe identity disorders and attachment problems. They had been torn from their biological families as infants and raised by people who knew they were living lies. The emotional distance this created manifested in rulers who were incapable of forming genuine relationships with anyone, including their own children. Emperor Joseph II of Austria, long considered one of the more enlightened monarchs of his era, exhibited behavior patterns that modern psychologists would recognize as classic symptoms of severe attachment disorder. His inability to connect emotionally with others, his obsessive need to control every aspect of his subjects' lives, and his profound loneliness, despite being surrounded by courtiers, all suggest someone who had never experienced authentic human connection. Recently discovered correspondence between Joseph and his physicians reveals that he suspected his own legitimacy from an early age. "I feel as though I am playing a role for which I was never properly prepared," he wrote to his personal doctor in 1781. "When I look in mirrors, I see a stranger wearing my face. When courtiers bow to me, I feel they are addressing someone else entirely. These aren't the words of a man secure in his divine right to rule. They're the confused observations of someone who had been psychologically damaged by deceptions he couldn't consciously understand." The women who participated in these substitutions, whether as mothers giving up their disabled children or peasant women surrendering their healthy babies, carried psychological scars that affected entire communities. Village records from across Europe describe epidemic levels of depression, suicide, and mental illness among women who had been forced to participate in royal substitutions. These women were sworn to secrecy about transactions that violated every maternal instinct, creating trauma that they could never process or discuss with anyone. Maria Gundula, a baker's wife from a small Bavarian village, left behind letters describing her experience of surrendering her newborn son to serve as a replacement for a disabled prince. "They came in the night with more gold than our village had ever seen. she wrote to her sister. They said my Johann would live in a palace, receive the finest education, want for nothing. But they took him before he had even opened his eyes properly, and I never saw him again. The money bought us a fine house, but it could not buy me a single night's peaceful sleep. I dream of him constantly, wondering if he knows his real name, if he remembers the sound of my heartbeat. The elaborate networks created to facilitate these substitutions developed their own internal politics and power structures that sometimes operated independently of the royal families they served. Professional child brokers emerged, individuals who specialized in identifying suitable replacement children and managing the complex logistics of switches. These brokers maintained detailed records of bloodlines, physical characteristics, and family histories, creating a shadow genealogy that paralleled and sometimes contradicted official royal lineages. The most successful of these brokers was a woman known only as Madame Corvina, who operated throughout Central Europe in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Her encrypted correspondence, discovered in a hidden compartment of a Prague townhouse in 1923, reveals a sophisticated operation that had facilitated over 40 royal substitutions across a dozen different courts. She maintained detailed medical records on both the hidden children and their replacements, tracked the political consequences of various switches, and even attempted to breed specifically suitable replacement children by arranging marriages between peasant families with desired physical characteristics. Madame Corvina's records reveal that the substitution business had become so systematic that some royal families were ordering replacement children before their wives had even given birth. Pregnant queens would be monitored by Corvina's agents, and if the child showed any signs of disability during delivery, a healthy substitute would be immediately available. The speed of these switches became legendary. Court records describe cases where substitutions were completed within hours of birth, before even the royal physicians could document the original child's condition. The psychological impact on the substitute children who successfully integrated into royal life was complex and often devastating. They lived with an unconscious awareness that something fundamental about their identity was false, even when they never learned the specific truth. This manifested in various ways. Some became obsessively devoted to proving their royal worthiness, others developed crippling imposter syndrome, and many showed signs of dissociative disorders that made effective governance nearly impossible. As we close the doors on these hidden chambers and walk away from the shadowed corridors where Europe's darkest family secrets were buried, we're left with a chilling reminder that the glittering palaces and grand ceremonies of history often concealed humanity's most shameful betrayals. Behind every crown that claimed divine blessing, behind every royal portrait that celebrated noble bloodlines, lay the broken lives of children who were sacrificed to maintain an impossible lie. These forgotten princes and princesses, hidden away like guilty secrets, remind us that the price of absolute power has always been paid by those who had no voice to protest their fate. Their stories, finally emerging from centuries of enforced silence, bear witness to the terrible human cost of a system that valued appearances over truth, political convenience over parental love, and dynastic propaganda over basic human dignity.